Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to How Happiness Thinks, our 6-week endeavor to invest in our happiness. Today, we are going to be doing lesson 2. And the title of today's lesson is The Joy of Purpose, Facing Stress with Patience, Mindfulness, and Hope. But before we dive into lesson 2, I want to take a moment to summarize what we did last week, both because there are some that are here on the Zoom today that weren't here last week, and I don't know if they got a chance to watch the recording. But more importantly, because I think it's very important with this course to remember what we said in lesson 1 before we begin every single one of our lessons. And let me explain. So last week, we opened up by kind of giving some science behind it, why happiness is so important, how happiness is not the result of a happy marriage and a successful business and successful finances and et cetera, but actually the opposite, being happy brings to a lot of those things. And after we discussed that, we discussed the difference between the way that the secular world looks at happiness and the way that the Jewish world looks at happiness. And we started that, like most notably, in the actual word. We spoke about how the word happiness is related to happenstance, haphazard, right? Hapless, all of it being, at least in the ancient days, the way they looked at happiness, the reason why they gave the word happiness to it, is that it was the result of your circumstances. It was nothing you were able to do about it, etc. And we contrasted that with the Jewish version, or the Hebrew word for happiness, which is besimcha, which means to be joyful. And we explained how the word besimcha has the same Hebrew letters, that's never by chance, but it has the same Hebrew letters as the word machshava, which means thoughts, which means our mind, the way we think. And this led to the title of this course, How Happiness Thinks. Why? Because the underlying theory behind this entire course is you can be happier if you choose to think a certain way, to think in a way that is happy. And that's a very, very important fact. So that was the first half of last week's lesson. And the second half was giving us one way to think happy, right? And that was to try and get into a state of flow by thinking less about ourselves, our own ego, being too narcissistic, thinking too much about ourselves often leads to a lack of happiness. That if we can get into a state where we can think less and less and less about ourselves, and it doesn't mean that we're knocking ourselves, doesn't mean throwing ourselves under the bus. Less ego doesn't mean less using my virtues and my the talents that I bring to the table. Doesn't mean doing that any less. It just means appreciating that they are all gifts from God. They're all things that true, I accomplished them, but it's not about me, and it's not about boosting my own ego. It's actually about living higher and being connected. Okay, so that was the first way to live happy, to think happy, and thinking happy will automatically lead to living happier. The reason I give this summary is because really every single week at the beginning of the lesson, when I go through kind of like the schedule for what we're going to do today, essentially what we are going to be discussing is another way to think happy, which will then lead to us being more happy. So today we're going to do 3 of them. 3 different tools, if you will, to have in your tool shed of a way to think with a happier attitude, which will then lead, or to change our perspective a little bit, which will then lead to actually being and feeling happier, which can then lead to all of the benefits that brings about, as we discussed last week. So all 3 today are going to fall under one umbrella. It's actually the topic of today's lesson. It's the title of today's lesson, The Joy of Purpose, right? So we're going to learn that if we can introduce a little bit more patience, mindfulness, and hope, if we can introduce a little bit more purpose into our lives, that we don't just live for the here and now or for our own enjoyment or for ourselves. So it's kind of dovetailing off or segueing from last week's lesson where we were trying to get rid of our ego. Is an important way to think happy. Another way to think happy is to always be focused on purpose. And that will lead to facing stress with patience, B, mindfulness, and C, hope. These 3 are the 3 things we're going to talk about today. I recognize that right now this all sounds cryptic to you, but appreciating the full lesson, I can say this is exactly what we're going to talk about today. All of them are going to be about living more purposefully. It is going to help us with patience, mindfulness, and hope, okay? Because essentially today's lesson is divided into 3 categories, 3 sections, if you will. In the first section, we are going to deal with being happy despite things going wrong in our lives. In the second, which obviously is a huge cause of stress. In the second section, we are going to talk about being happy despite having a lot of things on our to-do list, despite having a lot of responsibilities, which obviously is often a cause of stress in our lives when we have all these things that we need to do, all of these responsibilities. And the third section is going to talk about being happy despite worrying about the future, which again is one of the major causes of stress in our lives, is worrying about the future, right? And that's these three things that are going to help us with these three stress bringers. The three stress relievers are going to be patience, mindfulness, and hope. And all of them are going to be based on living purposefully. Okay, I hope that all makes sense to you. If it doesn't, they will begin to make sense to you one at a time as we go through the three sections of today's lesson. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is when things go wrong. All right, Mark, if I can ask you to get us started. On page 48, we have a text 1, and it's essentially a poem. When you're ready, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah.
By Charles Bukowski.
Okay. It's not the large things that send a man to the madhouse. No, it's the continuing series of small tragedies that send a man to the madhouse. Not the death of his love, but a shoelace that snaps. With no time left, the dread of life is that swarm of trivialities that can kill quicker than cancer and which are always there. License plates or taxes or expired driver's license or hiring or firing, doing it or having it done to you, or roaches or flies or a broken hook on a screen or out of gas or too much gas. The sink stopped up, the landlord's drunk, da-da-da-da.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you for delivering with such gusto. Because the list does go on and on and on and on. Now, I want to make one quick disclaimer. Today, we're going to talk about small issues that go wrong and that therefore cause stress in our lives. That is not to say that large issues that bring about stress in our lives, so think about the death of a loved one or the loss of a house in a hurricane or an earthquake or something like that, right? That's not to say that those things are not things that cause stress. We're just not going to be dealing with them today. It's actually the bulk of the topic of lesson 5. Lesson 5, which is titled When Joy Seems Elusive, is going to talk much more about, these crazy stressful situations, much larger situations, if you will, that cause stress. But for today, at least, we're going to talk about the small things. Okay. Now, Charles Bukowski is making a central argument in this poem. What's the central argument? That it's not the big things that get you. It's the small things. My question for you, Mark, is, do you find that argument to be true?
For me, no.
Okay.
I kind of, I don't find it gets me down. I keep going. Here's about
the small things. For you, it's about the big things.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
all right.
Yeah, just keep going. I know there's small things. I just keep going.
Okay. For many people, as this poem points out, this is more difficult for them to manage than bigger things. For example, a loved one being diagnosed with cancer, caring for a loved one, a loss of a loved one, a loss of a house, loss of major financial loss. For many people, these things, at least that's the argument of this poem, for many people, they actually are more stressful. So even if that's not the case for you, Mark, why do you think that for many people that is the case?
Because it's the minutia. They get caught up in the little things. They worry about. They have a higher. Their anxiety level is higher. They're more concerned with little things. That's just their point of view. Their nature.
Can I make a suggestion?
Say it again.
Can I make a suggestion?
Can they adjust? Is that it?
Can I make a suggestion?
Oh, yes, sir. Sure.
Maybe when it comes to bigger stresses in life, we kind of are more comfortable putting our lives on hold and dealing with it head on. We say, I'm going to deal with this major issue right now. That's number one. Maybe when it comes to bigger stresses in life, we end up having a much bigger support system. Our loved ones are like, oh, they just lost someone. You can't bother them now. Your boss says to you, I can't give him this project now because he just lost his wife, right? Your friends come over and say, hey, how can I help? They bring gifts over, etc. Whatever it is, right? When it comes to larger stresses, very often we actually deal with them. And I'll add to them, by the way, very often, not always, but very often these larger stresses are temporary. And temporary obviously is relative. But let's say the death of a loved one, you deal with it for a day, for a week, for a month, for a year. But at a certain point, your life moves on. And now you're no longer dealing with that major stress. If you have a major financial stress in your life, hopefully it's not ongoing day to day. It's you had a major financial loss, and right now you need to deal with that, and you deal and you move on. But very often when it comes to the small things, we almost try not to deal with them. You get stuck in traffic. You don't have a plan for how to deal with this. Every single day you get stuck in traffic. Every single day it's an issue, right? Your shoelace snaps. It's unexpected. It's here. It's tiny, and you're not equipped. You're not ready to deal with them, and that's why very often it's many of the small things that actually get people. On that note, if this isn't personal enough for you, I want to encourage you guys to take a pen. I think everybody has the book, right? Phil, you got your book already? Okay.
Yeah.
I think everybody has their books. On page 49, if we're going to continue this conversation, I think would be helpful if we're not using Charles Bukowski's examples, we're not using my examples, but rather we're using your examples. If you can take three things, list three recent experiences that triggered internal stress, I would encourage you to keep them small. If you recently experienced some major stress in your life, let's deal with that in lesson 5. For now, let's talk about smaller things. And maybe describe the consequences of what happened as a result of that stress. Maybe it caused you and your wife to get into an argument. Why? Because you have this small stress going on at work or whatever it is, right? Maybe it caused you to get fired at work. Maybe, I guess that's a major stress. But, small things and what the consequences are. And today, the main thing that we are going to introduce as the solution, so to speak, as the way to think happier, is we are going to talk about patience. Okay? Because when it comes to dealing with the minutia of life, with the ups and the downs, or as a friend of mine likes to say, the ups and the ups in life, that happen every single day to us, very often the solution is patience. And I want to explain what I mean by patience, because patience is a word that often comes with a very negative connotation. We often think of patience as like self-abstinence, so to speak. So let's say you want to eat lunch right now, but you have something to do. So you're going to, patience is, I'm going to wait half an hour until I eat lunch. So I'm kind of biting back on something that I want to do, and I'm waiting for that to happen, and I'm forcing myself to wait. That's not what I mean by patience. What I mean by patience is more the definition that's described in text 2. Larry, do you have your book with you?
Yes.
Okay, so you can read for us, please, on page 50, text 2. It's from a book. An article in the Wiley Blackwell Handbook of Positive Psychological Interventions. Text 2. Go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me? First of all,
can. Yes.
Okay. Patience, defined as the propensity to wait calmly in the face of frustration, adversity, or suffering, is a character strength just beginning to receive substantial psychological inquiry. Initial evidence supports that interventions intending to increase patience also lead to increases in well-being. Though people tend to think of the outward manifestations of patience, calm and tolerant behavior, it also has an inward emotional aspect, serene inner states. In fact, this inner component may be the defining feature of the virtue. Patience is not equivalent to delayed gratification, because delayed gratification involves a choice of whether or not to wait for rewards. In contrast, patience does not always involve a choice of whether or not to wait. The only choice a person may make is deciding how to wait. It may be helpful to conceptualize patience as a character strength, where instead of seeking to change the situation, people exert control by changing themselves to fit the situation. Thus, patient people are not being passive, but are actively adapting to face their circumstances.
Thank you, Larry. So what we mean by patience here is not just delayed gratification. We don't just mean the act of waiting for something, perhaps longer than you would have wished to. What we mean is how you wait. Being able to wait in a patient manner is a skill. Being able to wait calmly, being able to wait with more peace is a skill. So hence a more patient person will handle a snapped shoelace, for example, or traffic. They'll handle it better than a non-patient person based on this definition. And obviously now the $1,000,000 question is, it's on page 51, is what mental exercises, because this is all about thinking, how can we think, what type of mental exercise can we do which will actually lead to building patience? Okay, so that's what we're going to discuss for the next few minutes. And essentially it all boils down to how we, why we get annoyed. Okay, human reactions are not, contrary to popular perception, are not based on the circumstances that occur to us. Human reactions are largely based on the way that we frame the particular stimulus. There's this story that they tell about a man who walks onto the New York City subway. Raise your hand. Has anybody ever been on the New York City subway? Yeah, almost everybody. Okay.
Not in about 40 years.
Right. Okay, but the New York City subway also. I also want to clarify when I mean the New York City subway at 7:00 in the morning. Okay, so everybody that's on the subway has just woken up, and everybody's got their routine. There's the woman on her way to work, and there's the husband who's on his way to whatever, and the one who's on the way to the doctor's appointment. Everybody's got their thing. Everybody's got their own plugged-in way, and you come on, you get your seat, find your place, and you do your thing. And they tell the story of a man who walks onto the New York City subway with his 3 kids, and he completely does not have control over his kids. It's very clear. They're not being respectful. One kid trips over somebody else's feet and knocks over his coffee, and the newspaper gets all wet, and they're ruining everybody's routine, right? And meanwhile, the guy is on the phone, and he's on the subway. He doesn't even have reception. He's trying to be on the phone. Then he's sending a text message, and you could see that he's completely distracted, etc. And eventually, after one of the kids literally comes over to one of the passengers and starts, tapping him or doing something that's completely disrespectful, another one of the passengers looks at the dad and says, "What's wrong with you? Get a hold of your children." This is horrible. What's going on here? And the father looks at him and he says, "I'm so sorry. I'm just a little distracted." And the passenger looks at him and says, "Why? How could you possibly be distracted? What's wrong with you? Like, you're on a subway, respect other people. You're in a public place. Control your kids. Make sure they're respectful." So he says, "I'm distracted, and as are the children, because we just got the news that their mother was diagnosed with cancer, and she only has 3 days left to live." Oh. And immediately, the whole attitude in the subway shifts. Why? Because all of a sudden, instead of everybody being annoyed at him, everybody has compassion for him. Because they realize that this man is going through a life-altering situation, is tumultuous, et cetera, et cetera. The reason I think the story is so powerful is because nothing changed about the way the children were behaving. Their circumstances were exactly the same, except that the emotions and the reaction of the human beings that were watching it changed. Why? All because of what they had in their minds. Until now, they were judging this man. Oh, he's just a terrible father, and he doesn't care about other people, and he's not a mensch, and et cetera, et cetera. But the moment that they heard a little bit of background, their perception, their reaction changed because of the way they thought about it. And I think that's what we're going to try and do today. The reason we get annoyed is because these little things that are happening are changes in my schedule. There's an expectation that I have. There's a perspective in which I come to this situation. I'm planning to get from point A to point B, and I need to be at school or at work or whatever it is at 9:00. And there's traffic. And as a result of that traffic, I'm only going to be there at 9:30, which will cause my meeting to get delayed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I have a plan, I have an expectation, and that agenda is getting ruined, and therefore I become upset. But if we can change the way we think about that agenda, if we can change the way we think about our morning, if we can change the way we think about our shoelace being snapped, then actually our reaction will change, and it will not be a stress causer. Okay? And this comes down to a very, very fundamental Hasidic concept, which is that the happenings of the world are not meaningless and left to chance, but rather God directs a person's exact location and exactly as necessary for the fulfillment of his or her mission. Let's see, Phil, if I can ask you to read for us, please. Let's see text 3, which is on page 51. Let's see how Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, who was a student of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, let's see how he explained this phenomenon.
Yeah, I was just going to say nothing happens in this world by accident. So,
and that's going to be a key to not being stressed out by the situations, rather being happy despite. Go ahead.
We should clearly recognize that our travels to different places are not random, God forbid, but specifically directed by God. God's intention is that a particular person has a specific portion to rectify in a particular place, whether through Torah study and prayer, or through eating, drinking, and sleeping for the sake of heaven, or through another means of serving God. And the Baal Shem Tov of righteous memory explained the verse, God establishes the steps of man, meaning God imparts the desire to a person to travel to a specific place, God's intention being that the person should engage in a particular divine service, thereby rectifying what this person must rectify. Therefore, when we come to a particular place, we must take this to heart and ask ourselves, why am I here? For what purpose did God bring me here? It is certainly not for naught.
Thank you, Phil. So on page 52, what we're trying to do is apply this concept to the day-to-day stress and minutia. Why? You see, the cause of the stress, what's so annoying about missing a flight? Quite simple. I need to be somewhere. I had planned this flight, maybe for months in advance, and I need to be there at this and this time, and now I'm going to get late on the flight. And because I'm late on the flight, I'm going to be late to it, et cetera, et cetera. The expectation is I have an agenda, and I have a plan of where and what I'm supposed to be doing, and because that's not happening, therefore I'm stressed. What if we can change that perception? What if we can appreciate that wherever we are is where we're supposed to be, right? Not by the way, I want to give this a spin about the whole class, but also about today. This might not be a new concept to you. You may have heard of this before, but very often thinking about these things in the context of happiness really helps us to be able to deal with it when we need to deal with it. In this instance, let me give you an example. In 1979, and I'm not going to get into all the details of it, but I am going to share a firsthand documentary of it in the follow-up to today's lesson. I'm going to share a little link to a video which really chronicled this story. 1979, there was a group of women that had a Chabad women's convention in Detroit, Michigan. They were in Detroit for a couple of days. They had a beautiful convention. But by the time that they needed to leave the convention and go back, most of them were going back to New York or to the tri-state area, or wherever they were going, there was a blizzard and had grounded all flights. Now, this was a conference of a whole bunch of Chabad women, so they wrote to the Rebbe. And someone wrote to the Rebbe, or whoever was representing the group, they wrote to the Rebbe with the word stuck. That we're going to be stuck in the airport for many, many hours, and possibly even for Shabbos, etc. The Rebbe told his secretary to respond to them. And I don't remember the details of exactly how they got you'll watch it in the video afterward, how they got the message immediately. I think it was on the phone, whatever it was. The Rebbe wanted to understand what exactly the word stuck means. And the gist of the Rebbe's answer to them was, you're never stuck. A Jew is never stuck. You thought you needed to be in New York now. But the truth of life is, the truth, meaning from God's perspective, is that right now you're supposed to be in Detroit, Michigan. So figure out what it is you're supposed to do there and make it happen, because that is where you're supposed to be, and that'll change your whole mindset. And indeed, that's what the women did. I don't want to get into the whole end of the story. You can watch the documentary about how they made that stuckness, so to speak, be a lot not stuck and actually be a meaningful experience. Now, at the risk of getting a little too personal, I think many of you here know that I'm in the middle of a situation exactly like that. Why? Think about it. 3 weeks ago, we found a little leak. A little bit of water coming out of the ceiling. We thought, no problem, we'll call a plumber, he's going to open it up, he's going to find the leak, fix the toilet, re-wax the seal, whatever it is, and we'll be done. As you know, it's been 3 weeks, and we've been out of our house, now living at home, dealing with this mold remediation issue, and now they're rebuilding, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the most difficult part of this for us has been that we, as a family, had a plan. I mean, my children are starting school. One of them started school this past Friday. Another one is starting school tomorrow, right? We have food that our children like to eat. We have things that we like to do. We have comforts that we like to have, etc. I cannot even begin to tell you how many things that I have in my routine that go wrong just because I'm not in my own house. You don't think about it until you're out of your house, but everything is in your own house. I'll give you an example. 2 weeks ago, on a Sunday morning, the first Sunday morning that we were out of the house, I woke up, just wanted to do my regular Sunday morning schedule. Want to go for a run. After I go for a run, I go to the mikveh. After the mikveh, I study with someone here in my office one-on-one. Then davening, the morning service at 9 o'clock. Then I give a class at 10:30, etc. But let me explain. My running clothes were not with me. We were staying at Gitty's parents. My running clothes were not with me, so I had to go to my unit, go to my apartment, get to our townhouse, get the running clothes just in order to take a run. The amount of things. Think about the amount of stress that causes. Why? Because every single time that something is going different than the way you want it to go, you're busy thinking to yourself, I have somewhere to be. I have things to do, right? In order to give the class, I usually serve breakfast at the class. I had the vegetables for breakfast in my apartment. I'm going back and forth and jumping around. Everything is upside down. And this is usually the types of things that cause us stress in a day-to-day life. Why? Because we think we have a plan of where to be. Now, I'm not going to get that personal to say how often I'm successful or not successful at implementing this practice, but the practice that we're suggesting here is that in order, and I've definitely done it sometimes successfully, is that if you want to stay happy despite when things are going wrong, is to appreciate that they're not going wrong. They're actually going exactly as they're supposed to go. This is God, for some reason, I'm not supposed to be in my house this morning, and I'm actually supposed to be dealing with this in a different way, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I can think of some of the benefits to it. For example, and obviously, as we know, Gitti and I are doing exactly what all of us do in stressful situations like this, which is you're thinking about all the benefits that are coming out of it. One thing, for example, was our anniversary was last week. We had built-in babysitters. The kids were sleeping in my in-laws, and we were able to go out for the night without needing to pay for a babysitter. In the end, it looks like we're getting a brand new kitchen. Our landlord is installing a brand new kitchen. And perhaps these are things that we needed to happen. And actually, out of the kindness of his heart, God is saying, listen, you thought you were going to need to be in your apartment, and you would have just continued to stay in your apartment. So I give you a tiny little mold issue, like that you'll be where you're supposed to be, so you can accomplish what you're supposed to accomplish, whatever that particularly is. But I want to take this point one step further. 1 second, Mark. I know you have a question. I want to take this point one step further. And for this, we're actually going to turn to a video. Because right about now, most of you are thinking, okay, I can get on board with that for traffic. I can get on board for that for missing a flight. I can get on board for that if I have a mold issue in my house. Nobody caused this issue to me. So as a result, if I just change my perception, so now I'm much more happy about it. It's not so stressful. Why? Because God did it for a reason. Beautiful. Right? The circumstances happen for a reason. But what if there's actually somebody in the other end of the line that's doing something? For example, let's say it's business, and somebody's doing something negative to you, right? Let's say you're feeling horrible, and it's because of something that someone said to you. Is there a way to use this same idea and actually flip it around and think to yourself that there's a reason this could happen? It turns out that for many generations, Hasidim have been able to do this. And I'm going to give you, sorry, hold on 1 second. We are now going to go through two such stories, and they're going to be related by video. They're going to be narrated in the video. Where a chassid was faced with someone telling something to him or doing something to him, etc., and he was actually able to turn this into a positive. Okay? Please turn your attention to the video screens.
Rabbi Hillel of Parich was a master teacher of Hasidus and Jewish mysticism. When Reb Hillel traveled, his student Reb Shalom Homener would accompany him. One evening, they stopped at an inn and Reb Shalom began to pray the evening service. As part of the prayers, Hasidim often meditate deeply on the nature of God as well as undertake profound soul-searching. Reb Shalom spent so long meditating and praying that by the time he completed, the sun had risen. So, Reb Shalom began the morning service. Later that day, the innkeeper came to pray the afternoon prayers and saw that Reb Shalom was still in the middle of the morning service. The innkeeper, who was a simple villager, exclaimed, "What is it with this Jew? Yesterday, he spent the whole night in prayer, and now he has prayed the whole day. I'm different. I can just say Shema Yisrael and be done with it. Obviously, this man is a simpleton. Reb Shalom had completed his prayers and overheard this remark. His mentor, Reb Hillel, later commented, "The words of the simple villager had more impact on Reb Shalom in terms of self-improvement than 3 years of me teaching him the deepest secrets of Jewish mysticism." Rabbi Gershon Dov of Pahar was a chassid of the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom Dovber of Lubavitch. One of the highlights in the life of a chassid is when he meets privately with his Rebbe to discuss his spiritual life and receive direction for improvement. After much preparation and soul-searching, Reb Gershon came to the town of Lubavitch for his long-anticipated private audience with the Rebbe. As he waited in the antechamber of the audience room, Reb Gershon stood lost in thought near the place where the Rebbe's family hung their overcoats. Mendel, the attendant, saw him lurking in the corner and, not knowing Reb Gershon, was suspicious that he intended to steal something. Mendel grabbed Reb Gershon and led him forcibly to the exit door. Instead of explaining himself to the attendant, Reb Gershon wept and exclaimed, "I've been driven out of the Rebbe's antechamber. Evidently, I'm not ready for my private audience."
In both of these stories, you have a simple-minded Jew making a judgment call, a gross error. By all accounts, by objective accounts, he's mistakenly, he is mistakenly judging his fellow in a negative way, and the chassid on the receiving end could opt to tell him, "I'm sorry, you're wrong. I'm actually much more pious and holy than you think. And what I was doing for a reason, and it's wrong of you to judge me this way," right? But the Hasidim chose in both of these instances. Obviously, they were so in tune with their sense of happiness. They was like, "Okay, I'm right. I don't need to tell him I'm right. I can use this situation. Why would God make this person make a mistake to me? Right? Why would Hashem make this person tell me something negative or do something negative to me? Only because there's something for me to learn out of it, and each one managed to use it to somehow spring his personal growth forward." So instead of the expected reaction in both of these stories, which is to just get upset and oh, you bothered me and you said something about me, etc., and to let it cause them to get unhappy, they had an unexpected reaction, which is, no, let me internalize these words somehow and make them and turn them into a catalyst for growth. The underlying belief that allowed both these Hasidim to respond the way that they did, I'm on page 56 for those that are following, is that they didn't just insist on accepting these accusations. They weren't, as some would say, tolerant of abuse, if you will. Whoops. There we go. To them, they had this virtue. Oh, whoops, it's still sharing it as a video. Give me a second. There you go. To them, they had this virtue, which is patience. Whatever the annoying circumstance is, anything that's happening to them, even if it's perpetrated by someone else, to them, this was a part of the plan. They lived mission-oriented. They lived purpose-oriented. There's a reason for my suffering. There's a reason for the situation that I'm in. There's a reason for the abuse that's being done to me. Now, are they this shouldn't be confused with tolerating abuse. This isn't them saying, oh, the abuser had a reason to do that. No. Tolerating abuse is when you allow the words that someone else says to you that are negative words, you allow those words to control you. That's not what's going on here. They're saying these words were wrong, but I have a deeper perspective so that I can actually turn this into something positive, into something purposeful and meaningful and a catalyst for growth. The only way a person can think this way is if they view themselves every single day and every single moment as a shliach. Shliach is the Hebrew word for a messenger. And as we know, every single one of us is a messenger of God in this world. And if you appreciate that the footsteps of man are ordained by God, the reason you're in this place, the reason why you're listening to these words, the reason why you're interacting with this person is all because God wanted it to be so, because there's something here for you to do. So then you, instead of asking yourself, why did this happen to me, whether it's a missed flight or an offensive remark, instead of asking, why did this happen to me, you ask, what is there for me to do in this situation? The story is told about one of the Alter Rebbe's wealthy Hasidim, who was a very generous and very pious Jew. He gave a lot of tzedakah, and then he suffered a terrible financial downturn. And he came to the Alter Rebbe and he asked it. He poured out his heart. He asked the Alter Rebbe, why would Hashem do this to me? Why would Hashem do this to me? Why would Hashem do this to me? Etc. Right? And the Alter Rebbe answered him. This was way before JFK. He said to him, "You speak about what you need, but you have not thought about what you are needed for." Right? What's the famous line? Ask not what you can do for your country, what your country can do for you. Ask what your country can do for you. I'm sorry. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The Alter Rebbe said to him basically the same idea. Why are you so busy with what you need? You need more money and you can't afford to support your family and you have a problem because this and you have this. Instead of asking all that, maybe ask, what is this new situation provide for me? How can I serve Hashem? How can I go about my life? What does Hashem have in mind for me in this new situation? Then your attitude will change completely. Why? Because you're living purpose. You're living intentional. You're living with a higher, there's always a higher purpose in mind. At the risk of being a little exhaustive, let me share one more story. Rabbi Mendel Futterfass was a chassid who was imprisoned in the 1970s. Sorry, he came out in the 1970s. He was a chassid who was imprisoned in the former Soviet Union by the communists. And he was imprisoned for helping his co-religionists escape communist Russia. He was very, very instrumental in getting many Hasidim and many religious Jews out of Russia, whether to America or elsewhere in Europe, to France, etc., so that they can practice, and many of them to Israel, in order that they should be able to practice Judaism, Yiddishkeit publicly. And he shared the following story. He later came out in the 1970s, 1980s. He came out, and then he became like a mentor. And he would often share stories from his time in the Gulag, his time when he was imprisoned by the Soviets. And he shared the following story. He said there were a lot of other prisoners who, like him, were imprisoned for the terrible crime of being anti-communist, anti-Soviet, the Soviet Union. And many of them were even from the upper crust of society, professionals, intellectuals, and they were all imprisoned for the ostensible threat, right, that they constituted to the Soviet ideology. And many in this group, he said, very often wondered how I was able to maintain an upbeat attitude, be happy in the Gulag. How can a Jew be happy in the Gulag, right? They've taken away every single one of your freedoms, separated you from your wife and children for, I think, 20 years. The Rabbi Mendel Futterfass was in prison. And he said he shared with them once the idea. He said, every single one of you is dejected inherently for the same reason. Why? Because you were in the middle of life. You had your goals, your aspirations, your dreams, your expectations of the way your life was supposed to go. And your life's purpose was just snatched out from under your feet. You were imprisoned, and now you can't do whatever it is that you want to do. Right? He says, to me, because I serve Hashem, I believe that whichever situation I am in, that is the situation I'm supposed to be in. And there's a purpose. There's something for me to fulfill in this situation. That's the attitude we're talking about. The attitude of purpose. And we'll conclude this section on page 56 with the following learning exercise. In the first learning exercise, we asked you to share some recent stressful event and what the consequences were of that stress. Now we're asking you, think for a moment about one of those recent hassles, right? And the first question you can ask yourself is, what did I need out of life at that moment? Oh, I needed to go to work. I needed to help this. I needed to do that. I needed to be in this place at that time, etc. And then flip the script and try to ask yourself what was needed of me at that moment. Maybe because I went to New York one day later. Maybe because I didn't make it on my trip that I wanted to go on. Something happened here. What was needed of me at that moment? And did I rise to that challenge or did I not? But I would argue, and this concludes the first section of today's lesson, that this key, this tool of being able to think in this way, instead of what I need out of this moment, what is needed of me out of this moment, or at this moment, I think, changes the way we handle the day-to-day stress of life, and instead makes us be able to go about life in a much happier, much more peaceful manner. Hold on just a second. There's some background noise coming from somebody. I'm not sure. I'm going to mute you all. Feel free to unmute when it's your turn to read. Okay. Any questions before we keep going? Mark had a question. Go ahead, Mark. I muted you, so you have to unmute.
Okay.
There you go. Now we can hear you.
My question is, to me, looking at what the Russians did to the guy to put these people in jail for their suspicions, whatever, to me, that's evil. So what I'm like, my question is, how does do we conceive of evil as playing a part in this scenario of patience and developing?
Absolutely. The answer is absolutely. Yes, it does play a part. But I do want to make one disclaimer. That does not mean that the person who is perpetrating the evil is excused. This is not a conversation about the perpetrator. This is a conversation about the recipient, who could be perceived as a victim, but instead chooses to perceive himself not as a victim, but as, what can this situation do for me? In what way can this help me grow as a person? In what way can I make the most of life out of this moment? What am I needed for? How can I serve Hashem? How can I be a better person in this moment? This has nothing to do with the perpetrator of evil, who has to own up to God for the fact that he chose to perpetrate it. Does that make sense? So we're dividing here, if you will, even though it's difficult because it's the same act, but we're dividing the perpetrator and the act that he has perpetrated, and certainly the recipient of that act.
Okay.
Yes,
Bill, go ahead.
Just a quick comment. I mean, when we were having this discussion, it reminded me of one of the Kabbalah courses and the book I read, I think, The 4 Keys to Kabbalah, and the negative energy, and, you know, everything, that all the negative energy is put in situations to draw out the divine spark, and, you know, to find the light in every situation. I don't know if I'm saying that very eloquently, but it kind of reminds me of the same approach.
Yes,
and
absolutely. You're saying it very eloquently. And it not only does it remind you of the same point, it's the same idea when you boil it down intellectually to the same kernel. The Jewish concept called tikkun olam, which often is thrown around, people just throw it around like, oh yeah, make the world a better place, repair the world, whatever. At its core is a Kabbalistic idea. And that is that there are sparks everywhere, sparks of godliness. And sometimes you're in a particular situation in order to uplift and elevate that spark. And I think that's the Kabbalistic concept that you're referring to. And you might not know it. And think of the kindness that Hashem has in making you miss your flight. You think you're going to New York for a weekend. Hashem says, look, I know that your soul is supposed to be in Pasadena, whatever, elevating this and this spark, doing this and this thing, helping this and this friend, etc., whatever it is. I'm sure many of us can think of personal anecdotes like this. And out of the kindness of his heart, he makes you miss your flight. I know that's a strange thing to say, right? But out of the kindness of your heart, he says, listen, you're going to miss your flight, and it's going to be okay. Not only is it going to be okay, you're going to be in the right place at the right time for what you're supposed to accomplish in this world. And the way that leads to happiness is quite self-evident, I think. Okay. We are ready to move on to the second section of today's lesson, which is titled Mind Your Busyness. And essentially, this is how to deal with the stress that comes from your to-do list, right? In order to illustrate this, I want to encourage every single one of you to do this exercise with us, whether you're watching the video or whether you're doing this live with us here. On page 57, you have a simple learning exercise. It doesn't involve how happy you are as a person. Just right now, on a scale of 1 to 7, how happy are you? Okay, 1 is the happiest, 7 is the least happy. How happy are you? Put down a number, whatever it is. Okay, now, after you put down a number for how happy you are right now, this is the crucial element. And in the second section, exercise 3B, think of the things you need to do tomorrow. Or today, by the way, after this lesson, because we're not doing it in the evening. Think of 3 things on your to-do list. Write them down. And you can do more than 3 if you need to, but at least 3 things. And now I want you again to rate your happiness. Having thought about a whole bunch of things you need to do tomorrow, Did your happiness level change? And what I think most people, some people are nodding very, very enthusiastically. What I think most people intuitively understand is that their happiness changes. Why? Because they start to stress out about the things that they need to do tomorrow. I'm sorry for making you less happy. That wasn't my intention. My intention is to try to figure out this other type of stress, the stress of the things that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, right? We need to get the kids. Well, I'm using my own personal example, but I hope that's okay. You need to get the kids to school. You need to prepare this. You need to call this person. You have an email to send off. You have a project they need to complete. All these different things you need to do. What happens is often they bounce around in your head. Are you doing them now? You're not doing them now, but they're all together making you very, very nervous. And a lot of this has to do with this big myth called multitasking, which is we're trying to multitask, but perhaps more accurately put, it's multi-thinking. We're thinking about all these different things when really all I need to be doing right now is answering this one email. Instead, I'm thinking about, I didn't take something out for dinner, and my wife asked this, and my children need to be paid. All these different things that we have going on in our head. In Hasidic terminology, this is what's known as pizur hanefesh. Pizur hanefesh means dispersion of the mind. Okay? Your mind is in 1.5 million different places. This often is a big catalyst, if you will, for stress and for lack of happiness in a person's life. And the Hasidic Rebbes, for a very, very long time, have been teaching the value of the opposite of Pizur HaNefesh, the opposite of dispersion of the mind, which is Ichud HaNefesh, or living as a Pnimi. Ichud HaNefesh means oneness of the mind, or mindful engagement. In other words, live as a Pnimi. Pnimi is the Hebrew word which means internal. Live internally. So, right now you're answering an email. All of you should be answering that email and not doing anything else. You shouldn't be thinking about what's going to be with dinner tonight. You shouldn't be thinking about who's going to pick up the kids from school. You shouldn't be thinking about, my wife asked me to go pick up some things on the way home. Why? Because if you're in one place and your mind is thinking about one thing, as we know, multitasking is a myth. Multi-thinking is certainly a myth. The mind can only be thinking about one thing at a time. So if you have 10 things on your mind, then really inherently what's going on is you're thinking about one thing for a fraction of a second, then the next thing for a fraction of a second, then the next thing for a fraction. And what's going on is your mind is everywhere. Is it any doubt that your blood pressure is starting to go up and you're starting to feel stressed? There's a story of the Rebbe Rashab. The Rebbe Rashab was the 5th Chabad Rebbe. And there's a story. So I think many of you are familiar with a Farbrengen. That's when a Rebbe will talk and the Hasidim around will listen. And the Rebbe will share interesting insights from Hasidic thought. And then usually it's interspersed with what's known as nigunim. Nigunim are Hasidic melodies. So the Rebbe Rashab was once talking, and it came the time for a Hasidic melody. So they started a Hasidic melody and they started to sing. And he noticed that the Hasidim were so engrossed in the thoughts that the Rebbe had said just a moment earlier, and they wanted to get back to that thought stream. They wanted to hear the next idea, that they were rushing through the niggun. They were rushing through the Hasidic melody in order to be able to hear the Rebbe talk again. So the Rebbe stopped them, and he says, what I've been talking about over and over again recently is this concept of being a panimi, of being an internal person. Right now you're here. This is the activity you're engaged in. That's what you should be doing 100%. And that's true even of a Hasidic melody. Right now we're singing a melody. You have to be 100% in that melody. If you're busy thinking about what the next thing is going to, then you're not living in the moment, and that's a problem. There was a similar story that happened with our Rebbe. In 1970, many Hasidim came to celebrate Yud Shvat. Yud Shvat was the day that the Rebbe became Rebbe. It was also the yard site of his predecessor, the previous Rebbe. And in 1970, they were celebrating 20 years. 20 years. I don't know why I kept saying higher numbers, but 20 years from 1950 until 1970, since the previous Rebbe's yard site and the Rebbe being Rebbe, etc. So you can imagine many Hasidim came in. There was a big group. I think it was a charter plane that had come from, either it was a charter plane or they were all together on one flight that had come from Israel. And the Rebbe actually threw a Farbrengen. He held a Farbrengen as a farewell audience for these guests. They were leaving at whatever time it was, and the Rebbe was talking. The Rebbe noticed during the Farbrengen that all of these Hasidim were busy looking at the clock. So the Rebbe said to them, hold on. You're here at the Farbrengen. You came in order to hear me talk, and your mind is already on the plane. So in other words, in each situation, you're never present. You're never in the current moment. In order to emphasize the importance of negating this attitude, the Rebbe shared a story from his predecessor, the previous Rebbe, who was also the one whose yard site they were commemorating. The Rebbe shared the following story. Okay, in the 1920s, the Rebbe entered the room of his predecessor, the previous Rebbe. So this is the Rebbe now sharing a story from when he was younger. In the 1920s, the previous Rebbe, who was then living in Leningrad, which is basically today's St. Petersburg, and it was a few minutes before the previous Rebbe had to travel to Moscow. These were very, very harsh days of communism. Most Jewish leaders had either immigrated or been silenced. But the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, had dedicated himself to preserving Judaism, and because of these counter-revolutionary activities, he was under constant surveillance, and the state police was watching his every move. He was always in danger. The previous Rebbe was about to go to Moscow for some massive meeting where he was going to try and arrange something politically to make it easier for Jews, whatever it was. As he's about to embark on this journey, the Rebbe enters. In other words, our Rebbe entered his father-in-law's office, and it was less than an hour away from the scheduled departure time of the train or whatever it was, perhaps even only 15 minutes. And the previous Rebbe was sitting very calmly, as if it was a regular day, and he was studying Torah. He was engaged in a task that needed a lot of concentration. Now, self-control is a very important value in Judaism, right? But the Rebbe was amazed that his father-in-law, how he said, and in Yiddish, he said to him, Ad kidei kach, to such a degree, self-control. And the previous Rebbe answered him with a lecture about this concept of living in the moment. Phil, if I can ask you to read for us, please. We're on page 59, text 5. This is the Rebbe relating what his father-in-law told him at that occasion.
There is a concept called success in time. What does this mean? We cannot add actual time to the length of the day or night, but within the unalterable constraints of time, we can make the fullest use of it and utilize it to the maximum. In order to do so, we need to adopt the habit that when engaged in a particular activity, nothing else exists. Anything that is not pertinent to the matter now at hand, whether it is something that we have previously done or that we need to later do, should be considered as if it does not exist. All we have is the present moment, but because this moment, brief as it is, will be free of all irrelevant thoughts and matters about the past or future, we will have the ability to fully utilize that moment. This is success in time.
So the Rebbe turned back to the Hasidim that were at the Farbrengen looking at the clock. And he said, think about it. You're sitting here at a Farbrengen, you could be utilizing this time to grow, to be inspired, whatever, all the different things that we're doing here. Instead, you're thinking about a plane that doesn't even exist. If you live in the current moment, the plane doesn't exist. I recognize that's an extreme way of putting it, because obviously you have to prepare to get to a flight. But it was before the time you needed to go to the airport, right? It doesn't exist. Right now, you're in this moment. You're in this moment until a certain time when now you'll be in a new moment, and now you're moving on to the next activity, etc. If we can somehow implement even an iota of this is talking about success in time. But in terms of happiness, if we can implement that even to an iota, we would be much, much, much happier people. In 2010, the Pew Research Center found that 4 out of 5 adolescents in the United States sleep with their phones next to their bed. And there was a particularly alarming trend that was starting then. I'm sure it's only gotten worse since then. The Boston Children's Hospital reported the hospitalization of an alarming number of children that were being hospitalized for exhaustion. Evidently, many of these teens that are sleeping with their phones under their pillows, whatever, right? Every time they get a text message, every time they get a phone call, it's pulling their mind in a million and a half different directions. If in the middle of the night you're busy worrying about a text message that came in, or a text message that might come in, right? Because you have your phone next to you. Is it any surprise that it's going to lead to exhaustion? Your mind is in a million and a half different places. Right now you're sleeping. You should be fully sleeping, 100% sleeping, right? Now, clearly, mindfulness is very, very good for happiness. But has anybody wondered, why is that a good thing from a religious perspective? Like, why, from a Torah perspective, do we have to work on our mindfulness? And that's page 6. We're on page 60 here. One of the answers is that living in the moment touches on the same theme, which is the theme of today's lesson entirely, which is living purposefully, living with a purpose-oriented life, living mission-oriented. Chassidus teaches that there's a purpose in everything we do, no matter how secondary or trivial. So in other words, the preparatory step before going to the airport, when you call the Uber, there's a purpose in that moment. There's a purpose in that activity, right? If you're going to study Torah, but right now, or whatever, listen to a lecture on Torah, but right now you're singing a niggin, right now you're singing a melody, it's not just a preparation. It's actually, this moment is a moment. This activity is an activity. Everything is purposeful. If we can start to live that way, then we can eliminate completely the stress from what's known as pizur hanefesh. Why? Because we're living with every single moment being, how should I let all these things bother me about right now? I'm in this moment and I have to be doing what I have to be doing. Now, that's not to say you can't have a moment which is dedicated to scheduling. You could have in the evening 10 minutes when you plan your day for the next day. You could have in the middle of the day 5 minutes when you, whatever it is. But that would be a 5 minutes of scheduling. 5 minutes of, imagine if every time you tried to worry about the 10 different things, you said, well, don't worry, at noon, I have 5 minutes dedicated to worrying about the 10 different things. It wouldn't be as stressful at all. You're in control. You're the one who's saying, now I'm going to worry these 10 different things. How am I going to disperse them or delegate them so that they all get done properly by me, by someone else, whatever it is, and they don't worry, they don't stress me out. So instead of while I'm trying to do one of the tasks, I'm worrying about the other 9, for a few minutes, I'm dedicated to thinking about all 10 of them. It's not stressful because it's pragmatic and practical and exactly how I'm going to go about it. And then for the rest of the time, I don't think about it. It's a very, very powerful way of living life. To those of you that are thinking right about now, sure, Rabbi, no problem. I agree with you. It's an amazing way to live life. But how can you control that? Like when I have something stressful going on in my life, how can I stop it from coming into my mind? I'll share with you the following story. Then this will conclude the second section. The Maggid of Mezrich was the second leader after the Baal Shem Tov. He was the second Hasidic leader after the Baal Shem Tov, who founded the Hasidic movement. So he really brought the Hasidic movement to flourish. And he had a disciple who complained that he couldn't control his thoughts. Exactly the same complaint. He has all these thoughts popping into his mind. He's like, I can't control them. They just come, right? So the Maggid advised him that he should consult with a rabbi whose name was Rabbi Wolf of Zhitomir. He lived in a city called Zhitomir. His name was Wolf. He was a rabbi. He should go and consult with him. Fine. So this fellow was having this issue controlling his thoughts. He went to go visit Rabbi Wolf of Zhitomir. He asked around the city where he lives. He finds the house where he lives. It's about noon. He knocks on the door. No answer. He hears people inside. So he keeps knocking louder and louder and louder. Because, okay, maybe they're busy with something. He comes back an hour later. He knocks louder. Nobody letting him in. Later on, it becomes late at night. He had nowhere to go. So he crawled up by the doorstep and he fell asleep. This was supposed to be his host. Fine. So he fell asleep. In the morning, Reb Wolf opened the door and he let him into the house. And he tells the man, you see, this house, I am the master of this house. If I don't want you to enter, you won't get in no matter how hard you try to get in. In this way, the Wolf was teaching this particular disciple that this is the same thing is true about our minds. We often, out of laziness, we like to convince ourselves that we have no control over it. But that's never the case. We are always in control of every single thought in our mind. Something pops in, you can close the door and say, no, thank you, not now. I don't want to think about this. Now, it might be helpful to have something else to think about. You know, the Hasidic perspective, Hasidus is a very big proponent of meditation. But meditation from a Hasidic perspective is very different than meditation from I don't know, from the Far East or whatever, these other popular forms of meditation. Most forms of meditation, if anybody's ever practiced it, they advise you to empty your mind of every single thought. Don't let anything, empty your mind of everything. Just focus on your breathing or the way your body moves or whatever it is, right? The Hasidic perspective of meditation is the exact opposite. Fill your mind with one thought, a Torah thought, an observation about the vastness of the universe and how God created the universe, whatever it is. Find something to concentrate on and only concentrate on that. Don't concentrate on anything else, right? Why is this such a powerful form of meditation? Because think about it. There was a researcher who once did. I'm trying to think. I think this was quoted here. Give me a second. I'll even be able to quote who it was. No, I guess it wasn't quoted here. I just know from somewhere else. There was a researcher who once did a research study in which he asked the participants in the study to focus on to tell them about a particular topic, whatever it is. Tell me about your life, right? He said, while you're telling me about your life, I don't want you to think about polar bears. Do not think about polar bears, no matter what. Then he put a little bell down in front of the participants. He said, every time you think about a polar bear, right? And I don't want you to think about it. Think about it as least as possible. But every time you think about a polar bear, I want you to tap this little bell, right? What happens when you tell somebody not to think about something? As they were talking to them about whatever it is that they were talking to them about, they were ringing the bell over and over and over again. Why? Because the polar bear kept popping its head because they were told not to think about it. This is why Chassidus says it's very, very important not to allow all different distracting thoughts into our minds. But one of the best ways to do that, if we find them coming in, is to find something that we're in the middle of doing or that we're supposed to be doing and focus 100% on that task, which will then and use our minds for that. And then that will allow us not to get distracted by it. With this, we conclude the second section, which is how to deal with the to-do list kind of stress that comes up in our life. So to summarize where we are now, in the first section, we discussed when things go wrong. And the solution to that was patience. Patience as in dealing with the situation in a calm way, appreciating that there's a purpose in every single place that you're supposed to be in. Hashem is directing that. That was the first section. In the second section, we dealt with the Pizur HaNefesh phenomenon, the dispersion of the mind, where your head is in a million different places. The solution to that is mindfulness. Recognizing that in each moment, we have to be mindful and live with intention. In that moment, be in the moment, not be anywhere else. And we learned some hacks and tips of how to deal with that. Now we are going to move on to number 3. Number 3 is the worries about the future. What the future holds. There is a verse in Proverbs written by King Solomon, which is text 6a. Mark, can you read it for us, please?
Okay. 6a?
Yes.
Okay. A worry is a person's heart. Cast it away.
In Proverbs, King Solomon tells us, Daiga belev ish yashchena. Okay. Now the reason I'm saying it in Hebrew is because the proverb is going to be translated 2 different ways. Because there's different ways to think about this proverb. The verse seems to be telling us that if you have a negative thought, if you have a worry, if you have concerns about the future that are bogging you down, suppress it, ignore it. But it's not so simple. It turns out when the Talmud unpacks this verse, there's actually 2 ways of thinking about it. Mark, keep going, 6b.
Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi interpreted this verse. One said, cast it away from the mind. The other said, speak about it with others.
Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, as we know in Hebrew, the words in the Torah, or the words in Tanakh, do not have nikud. They don't have the nikudot. They don't have the vowels around them. So any word that you come across can be read 2 different ways. So this last word, yashchena, please hold 1 second. Someone's at the door here. No worries. Okay, I'm glad we interrupted. It was just somebody who wanted to come in and put on tefillin. He works in the area. He's in now and he's putting on tefillin. So let's go back to this word yashchena up here, the last word in the verse. It's here. It's vowelized as yashchena, but actually another way to vowelize it is as yaschena. What does yashchena mean? Yashchena means take it, push it away, suppress it, ignore it. Yaschena means like the word sicha, which means to talk. Talk it over with someone, right? Speak it out with someone else. And Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi had 2 different opinions about what the best way to do it is. And perhaps, by the way, they're not even arguing with each other. Maybe the best way to push it away sometimes is to actually talk it over with a friend, to talk it out with someone. So you have a worry, you're not sure how to deal with that worry. Yashchena, push it away. In which way? By Yashchena, by talking it out with someone else. Question for the crowd here. It's on page 61. Has one of these solutions worked for you in the past? Casting your worries away or talking it out with a friend? Has that been effective for you or for someone you know? And if yes, why did it work? Anybody?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mark.
I often speak about my problems to other people, and that diffuses the tension or the stress. It reduces it for me.
Okay, so you went to the less obvious one first. I like that. The more obvious one would be when you talk it over with someone else. Very often they have a solution to your problem. You're maybe caught up in the moments, therefore you can't think about it. You don't have a solution, but they have a solution to the problem. Talking it over with someone else provides a fresh perspective. But Mark is suggesting something even deeper. Perhaps just by talking it out, right? It doesn't feel so worrisome. Sometimes when we have a worry in our head, we build and build and build it up into this massive cloud that's casting a dark shadow over our whole life. When really, if you talk it over with someone else, it's like, okay, I talked it over now. I spoke it over now. Now I know exactly what it is. It's defined, and I've let it out, and I've worked my way through it. It's not as imposing anymore.
Again, in real life, you also need to be able to talk it over with someone you trust.
Absolutely. The Tzemach Tzedek, and this is exactly where I was going to go. The Tzemach Tzedek said that the person who you talk it over with is actually very, very important. Why? Because if that person is not, it shouldn't just be someone who is other in body. Sorry, it has to be someone who's only other in body, not other in soul and in perspective and in emotion, etc. If you're talking it over with somebody you love, it turns out one of the biggest things that we get out of it is the bonding itself mitigates the stress. The very fact that somebody else cares about this issue just like you, cares about your issues just like you do, causes a lowering of the stress of it, causes you to be less worried about it. There was a chassid who once wrote to the Tzemach Tzedek, so that was the third Chabad Rebbe, and he worried about his health and his financial situation. In other words, this chassid took the advice of the second Talmudic view. You know, he let it all out to the Tzemach Tzedek. He wrote a whole long letter, or maybe I think it was, no, it was a letter, and he wrote it to him, and he let it all out. And the Tzemach Tzedek basically advised what we've just been talking about, but he elucidates it so clearly and so beautifully. Take a look at text 7. Larry, can you read it for us, please?
Sure. I'm not going to read the Yiddish part, but I'll.
That's okay.
I'm responding to your letter in which you write about your fears, though they are very much unwarranted. Okay. You've been granted the choice and authority to think, speak, and act according to what you consciously desire. Which is very Tanya-esque. Even if you experience the emotion of fear, you are able to remove your thoughts, speech, and actions from that emotion. The essential thing is not to think or speak about this fear at all. Immediately upon not thinking about it, the fear will automatically dissipate. At the very least, the fear will become dormant and will not be felt in your body. And over the course of a few days, it will completely dissipate to the point that it will not come up in your mind at all. The reason that removal of the thought nullifies the fear is because all emotions are sustained by the mind through the medium of thought. Therefore, by removing the thought, the mind is disconnected from the emotion, and the emotion is no longer aroused.
Thank you, Larry. So let's take a look at what's going on. So my Tzedek is advising as follows. First of all, stop thinking and speaking about the worrisome thing. Why? Not just because it's causing you stress, but the reason is because that when you think and speak about a worrisome thing, it's causing you to feel a certain way. It's causing you the emotion of stress. Next, distract your thoughts with another engaging activity or thought. Why? Because as we mentioned earlier, and it's actually text 8, if you try to not think of a polar bear, that's exactly what you're going to think about every single minute. And that's why he suggests, why don't you put in something to replace that thought? A Torah thought is amazing, but even if not, something else. Something. This is such a powerful concept. Why? Because when Larry threw in there that it's very Tanya-esque. Yes, this is the Alter Rebbe's grandson. The Alter Rebbe was the founder of Chabad Hasidism, and Tanya is the Bible, if you will, of Chabad Hasidism. And over there it talks about how your mind controls your heart, and you can control your emotions by controlling your mind. And that's exactly the Tzemach Tzedek here, his grandson, is applying that concept. He's saying if you can control your mind, you can make sure that in your mind you're not thinking stressful thoughts. So then the way it translates into emotion, it won't translate into that emotion. Okay. The problem is, as discussed with the polar bear, that the more you think about something, the more you try not to think about something, the more it's going to come to your mind. So for this, the Tzemach Tzedek also has a suggestion. Larry, keep going. Text 9.
The primary method of removing negative thoughts from your mind is by directing your mind towards other matters. This might be even worldly matters. They are necessary and make you happy, or God's Torah, which delights the heart, by establishing fixed times for daily study of Torah, particularly with a study partner.
Okay, this is the idea that we mentioned earlier, and here we have the science to back it up. Text 10. Go ahead, Larry.
As long as we attempt suppression only, then the harder we try, the deeper we get ourselves into the soup. When we attempt self-distraction, in contrast, our efforts can get us somewhere. If we wish to suppress a thought, it is necessary to become absorbed in another thought. The distractor we seek should be something intrinsically interesting and engaging to us, and even if it is unpleasant, should not be boring or confusing.
So thus, this letter of the Tzemach Tzedek it features an interesting combination. The Chassid is writing to the Tzemach Tzedek and unloading about all of his worries. Thus, following the second opinion of the Talmud, if you have a worry in your heart, speak it over with a friend. And the Tzemach Tzedek is telling him you would be better off following the first opinion in the Talmud, which is if you have a worry in your heart, cast it away. Suppress it. Don't think about it. And here are some tips as to how you can go about it. Now, removing the worrisome thoughts is really only step one, right? Let's say you successfully remove those worrisome thoughts. Now you need to replace those worrisome thoughts with, which is a much more effective way of doing it, with something else that is actually a positive thought, with some hope for the future. You're worried about something for the future. By the way, we haven't even gotten into the weeds about whether this particular thing that you're worried about in the future is a valid concern or not a valid concern. So unless we're worried about things in the future, it's not even a valid concern. But right now, we're not even dealing with that. Valid or not, right now it's worrying you. The first thing you should do is distract yourself from it. Get rid of it from your mind. But then you want to replace that attitude in your mind with an attitude of hope. And hope. If any emotion is directly connected to believing in God, hope is connected to believing in God. But not just believing in God, it's connected to trusting in God. You see, foundational to Jewish belief, of course, is to believe in God. We believe that God created the world. We believe that God interacts with the world. We believe that God runs the show in the world. Beautiful. Okay. But what about trust? Trust is a much more difficult thing to attain. Trust is an emotion. It's not just a belief. It's not just a conviction that I believe that there is a God. It's to trust in God and to trust that He actually is taking care of me. Think about people that we trust. Let's do this exercise together. In fact, you know what? We're not really going to do the exercise. I'm going to fill it out with you, and you're welcome to do it with a pen if you'd like. This comes from a book known as Chovat HaLevavot. Chovat HaLevavot is a book called Duties of the Heart, or Obligations of the Heart, written by an 11th century scholar, Rabbeinu Bachya Ibn Pakuda, and a Spanish scholar, of course, right? So if he's in the 11th century, he's most likely going to be Spanish, from Jewish perspective. And he basically writes this book called Obligations of the Heart, in which basically he gives instructions on the mitzvahs that command us to feel a certain way. So loving a fellow, loving God, trusting in God, right? All these different, how do you go about that? So in his section on trusting in God, the way he goes about this is he starts off, he says, let's list the qualities that you need to trust someone else, right? And if you pay attention on the screen, we'll go through 7 of them. He says, in order to trust someone else, a human being, never mind God, in order to trust someone else, we have to believe that that person has compassion and love for us. We also have to believe that that person is generous, not just that they would give it to you if you're deserving of it, but even if you're not deserving of it. We have to believe that that someone knows what's best for us. If they don't know what's best for us, it's silly to trust them, right? If you trust your dad, or your parents, which in a healthy relationship, often the deepest trust that a person has is for their parents or for their spouse, etc., right? But your parent doesn't know that you're suffering. It's a silly idea to trust them to take care of you if they don't even know that you're suffering, right? So they need to know what's best for you. Let's keep going. Number 4, the person that you're trusting has to not be forgetful or lazy about helping. They have to be somebody who actually will invest in helping. They have to be strong. They have to be capable of helping you, right? If it's your father and you need him to help you, but the thing you need him to help you with is, I don't know, with lifting a couch, but he's not strong enough to lift the couch, I wouldn't trust him to lift the couch, right? They also have to have complete and exclusive control over our destiny. The last one is they have to have already taken care of us in the past, right? The reason why many people have a very, very firm trust in their spouse or in their parents is because they have a huge history with them. 30, 40, 50 years, however long, that they've been taking care of them and they've never done anything to wrong them. And actually, in many relationships, if the person does too many things to wrong them, then it starts to erode that trust, right? Now, all of these things can be true about a human being to one degree or another. And if you think about human beings in your life, you will think there are some of them that have more of these things and some of them that have less of these things, and therefore you trust them more or less. Or they have maybe all of them, but only to a certain degree. For example, take a look at number 6. Number 6 is they can only be true about God, right? Has complete and exclusive control over our destiny. No human being has that, but God has complete and exclusive control over our destiny. So it says, let me advise the following. If a person is missing in trust in God, if a person feels that they will not be able to trust God, here's an idea, here's a tip. Start to meditate. I mean, first he brings verses from the Torah that show us that Hashem is all of these things. Hashem is compassionate. Hashem is generous, even if we're not deserving. He knows what's best for us, and he's not forgetful. He's strong. He's capable. He's omniscient. He's omnipotent. He's all these different things, right? And then he says, if a person is missing in their trust in Hashem, what they can do is start to meditate about all 7 of these things, and they can actually begin to trust in Hashem. Turns out the Americans got it right when they put on the dollar bill, in God we trust. We don't just believe in God, but we trust in God. And they put it on the dollar bill, on the currency, which is one of the things that people need the most trust in Hashem for. The most bitachon, which is the Hebrew word for trust. It turns out that the strongest thing you can do, if you're worried about something, is obviously the prerequisite which we spoke about. The first step 1 that we spoke about already, is distract yourself from it. Don't be so worried about it. But step 2 is fill yourself with hope. In chapter, I think it's 55 of Tehillim, of Psalms, there's a line that says, Hashlech al Hashem Yehavecha. Take your package, take your worries, throw it off onto God. I have a brother-in-law who grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana. Now, he left before Katrina, before 2005, but his mother was there in 2005. What were they doing there? Anybody want to guess? His parents are the first Chabad emissaries, the first Chabad shluchim to the state of Louisiana. And he once shared with me the following story. He said that his parents were one of the first to come back to New Orleans after Katrina, way before everything was rebuilt or even they were letting anybody else in. It was deemed necessary. They were rabbis and they were able to support everybody that was there. There were soldiers there. There was FEMA there. There was all sorts of governmental employees there, etc. Volunteers, Red Cross, you name it. And many of those people were Jewish, and they were servicing them, right? Okay. And obviously, it wasn't easy for them either. You're in a situation of constant stress. Anything you want, it's impossible to get it done, right? You want to, for example, there's an issue with your plumbing, and you want to, let's say, I don't know when the plumbing was turned on, but once the plumbing was turned on, now you have an issue with your plumbing, you need a plumber. There's no plumbers in town. Everything is like pulling teeth. Everything was extremely stressful. And she's spoken over with her brother. Her brother of blessed memory, Rabbi Josh Gordon, was the senior Chabad rabbi in the valley, the San Fernando Valley. And he said to her, he said, Bluma, you know what you need to do? You need to make yourself 2 lists. I'm sure you have 1.5 million to-do lists. He said, you need to have only 2 lists. One list, call it Bluma's list. Tomorrow I need to pack this, I need to do that, I need to move this, I need to fix that. Whatever it is, that's your list of stuff you need to do. And the other list, call it Hashem's list, God's list. And these are the things that they need to be done, but they're outside of your control. Put them on there and let Hashem worry about them. And in this way, if you can actually develop a trust in Hashem for them, if you can actually develop a palpable trust in Hashem, then your whole attitude changes. In his introduction, Rabbi Nebuchadnezzar Ibn Pakud, in his introduction to his book, which is text 11, Phil, if we can ask you to read it for us, please. he describes what a boteach b'Hashem looks like, what somebody who trusts in Hashem looks like. We're on page 65, Phil, if you please.
The benefits of trusting God include tranquility of the heart in the face of worldly worries. The one who has trust finds quiet, security, and serenity within this world. As it is written, blessed is the man who trusts in God. God will be his reassurance. And it says, he will be like a tree planted by water, sending out its roots by a brook.
Thank you. You know, you don't even have to take his word for it. In 2010, 125 self-reported believers, believing Jews, not necessarily Orthodox, not necessarily religious, but Jews that believed in God. They had elevated but subclinical, in other words, that's very crucial. It wasn't clinical levels of stress, but they had elevated levels of stress. They took part in a very interesting study. They were divided into 3 groups. One group engaged each day for 2 weeks in progressive muscle relaxation. It's called PMR. Right? Sometimes used to relieve people from their stress. Whatever, there's a technique to monitor and control the state of muscular tension. The second group was told to do nothing, called the waitlist condition. It's like a control, right? And the third group engaged in a spiritually integrated therapy. Today it's known as SIT, every single day for 2 weeks. A Jewish psychologist, Dr. David Rosmarin, conceived this spiritual program. And he consulted with rabbis to identify Jewish spiritual strategies for coping with stress, some of the things we've been discussing today, and how to not be worried and trust in Hashem and focus on trusting in God, etc. The daily program actually begins, this SIT program begins every with stories of people who had trust in God or stories that highlight the importance of trust in God. Then you read certain verses or certain chapters from Chovat HaLevavot, from this duties of the heart, right? The Shara B'Tachon, which we discussed, or from other works that talk about the same concepts, explaining how you have to trust in Hashem. After each passage, there was a summary of the reading that was presented, and participants are asked to read each section aloud. This is how the program works. You can imagine how it works, right? Finally, participants are encouraged to daven, to pray. And they did this program for 2 weeks. Remember, they had the other 2 programs as well, one that engaged in PMR, and the one that was just doing nothing. Participants in each group completed self-report assessments, measuring their anxiety before they started this 2-week treatment, after they followed the 2-week treatment, and then 6 to 8 weeks following whatever treatment they did, they were asked to do an assessment. And text 12, which is going to be our final text for today, were the findings. Mark, can you read for us, please?
Participants in the SIT virtually integrated treatment group reported significant reductions in stress, worry, depression, and intolerance to uncertainty. Symptom improvement was clinically significant at pre-treatment. Participants in the SIT group reported near clinical levels of stress and worry. And at post-treatment and in 6 to 8 week follow-up, reported levels where it were in the normal range. The SIT group reported greater treatment gains compared to WLC waitlist condition participants. Surprisingly, PMR, progressive muscle relaxation, and WLC participants did not differ on most outcomes. It is also interesting that Orthodox affiliation was not a predictor of treatment outcomes in the SIT group. SIT is likely not appropriate for all Jewish individuals. Nevertheless, this surprising finding suggests that interest in SITs among Jews extends beyond the Orthodox community.
Thank you. And sorry he's not here today. He's going to watch the video afterwards. But we have, as one of our students in today's lesson, we have a professor. His name is a doctor, a psychologist. His name is Dave Barron. And Dave literally deals with this. He deals with positive psychology. He has a psychiatry program called lifestyle psychiatry, in which essentially he encourages people to involve spirituality as part of their happiness. It turns out that people that are more spiritually integrated, they have lower levels of stress. And the good news is that from a Hasidic perspective, we're told, and this is not something you have to introduce from outside your life. You actually have it within you. You just need to reveal it. This concludes our solution to the third section of today's lesson, which was worries about the future. So our solution has been, number one, distract yourself from it, talk it over with a friend, replace it in your mind with, instead of all these negative thoughts, replace it with positive thoughts, which will therefore lead to positive emotions. And perhaps most importantly, strengthen your bitachon muscle, strengthen your muscle of trusting in God. This concludes today's lesson. Please turn your attention to the video screens for a summary of today's lesson. Oh, we did this already, sorry. There we are.
Lesson 2. 1. For a life of joy, we need a mental framework that will help us deal with our daily stresses and annoyances. 2. The places we go are not random, but precisely directed by God toward a specific purpose. When we come to a particular place, we should ask ourselves, for what purpose did God bring me here? 3. We should be keen on finding purpose in everything we experience. We should learn to find growth even from annoying moments. Instead of processing them as stressful experiences, we can process them as something beneficial. 4. When life is about personal pursuits, it is difficult to identify the purpose in frustrating circumstances. The more mission-oriented we are, the more we are able to convert our hassles into opportunities for growth. 5. There is purpose in everything we do, no matter how secondary or trivial. When engaged in a particular activity, we need to vest our entire mind and heart into it, because at this moment, this endeavor constitutes the purpose of our existence. 6. The Talmud presents 2 approaches for dealing with worrisome thoughts. One approach is to discuss one's worries with another person. Another approach is to cast away worrisome thoughts. 7. Although human beings have the capacity to control their minds, it is often counterproductive to try to stop thinking of something. To cast away a thought, the mind must become absorbed in something else. 8. To trust in someone means to believe he or she will take good care of us. In God we trust helps us cultivate optimism about the future.
Thank you all for joining us for lesson 2. This has been lesson 2 of How Happiness Thinks, the Joy of Purpose. And next week, we will continue with lesson 3, which is called The Joy of Having. And what's so powerful is about it is that next week we're going to talk about another way to think happy, which is the attitude of gratitude, the importance of gratitude in keeping us happy, which I think comes as no surprise to everyone, but we'll deal with it next week. Thank you all for joining us.